For 20 years, we've been creating innovation in the CX industry, and now we're seeking out brilliant new perspectives on CX you just won't find anywhere else. I'm Richard Owen. Welcome to the CX Iconoclast. My guest today, Kevin O'Meara, now operates as Executive Vice President, Business Transformation at Shaw Industries, where he has a wide remit to drive change across what is an iconic US manufacturer, at one point part of the Fortune 500, but now wholly owned by Berkshire Hathaway. Kevin brings a wealth of supply chain and manufacturing experience to his current role, having previously run the integrated supply chain operations at Shaw, but also following similar roles at Whirlpool and Schneider Trucking and Logistics. All this after serving as a captain in the US Army. What I find most interesting about Kevin's perspective is how he sees manufacturing emerge from what is historically perhaps a back office function to being far more integral to delivering customer experiences, with the necessary changes needed in both speed, adaptability, and, after all, mindset. He also brings a great viewpoint on building capabilities to thrive in what is a constantly changing risk and competitive environment. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Well, Kevin O'Meara, thank you for joining us today on the CX Iconoclast.
Thank you for having me, Richard. Appreciate it.
Of course. And look, I'd love to start a little bit with your far distant career now, I guess, with the Army and that transition. And so you moved from military life to civilian life, and perhaps you could start by just sharing what you saw as the biggest difference when you got out the military and you started to move into commercial businesses.
Well, I think a couple things. I mean, at first, it wasn't as much different as you would think. And that I know a lot of people think the military is, very hierarchical and structured, and you just kind of do what you're told. And the commercial business world is not, but that's not how the military is at all. And so you have to have good leadership. You have to have the good why. You have to be able to really interact with personalities and be able to build relationships with people. So as I said, it's not as different as you'd think. However, there are obviously some differences. I mean, first thing is it's not life or death. We have to keep reminding ourselves in commercial business, this isn't a life or death endeavor that we're on. And probably secondly, and more importantly, is you're dealing with so many different people outside I'll call it your contained enterprise. I mean, when I was in the Army, especially the U.S. Army anyways, you pretty much contained within the U.S. Army and the other services. But in commercial business, you're dealing with people all over the world that you may or may not even know or may not even be able to have seen before. And you have to build good relationships that way as well. So that's probably one of the big differences, I would say.
And when we're here to talk about supply chain logistics, and I think in some ways the military was always a pioneer in that because of a very practical matter, right? They have, and very contingency based, right? You've got such scenarios that are constantly changing to address with logistics.
100%. I mean, it is they always say an army moves on its stomach, and one of the biggest things that modern military has brought to the world is logistics. When we went to Saudi Arabia for the first Gulf War, there's a commanding general in charge of all the logistics, Gus Pagonis, that wrote a book called Moving Mountains. And he essentially said that we moved what is almost the equivalent of the entire state of Rhode Island to Saudi Arabia in the span of, a couple, 3-4 months. And I was in Rotterdam in Europe, and we moved the equivalent of an entire division out of. In fact, we were still moving it, and the war was over. So that's how much equipment we were moving. So.
It seems like there's some incredible practical challenges associated with that, and so you move from that into the commercial world, and you've been very generous over the last few years in publishing a lot and talking a lot about supply chain. It's obviously something that's close to your heart. If you look back now over this period of time since you got involved in this, could you point out some of the big changes that you've seen over that time?
First thing I would say is that companies have realized that they compete on supply chains, especially retail companies. They really, really compete on supply chains. Probably when I first joined supply chains, which and worked in the automotive space a lot. They were tended to be seen as, hey, this is a cost that we can cut. Let's figure out how to cut it, really get the efficiencies, which I understand and that, but at some point, and it might have been right after the year 2000 or so, what I started seeing is people started saying, no, we can actually compete on supply chains. Velocity of product through the supply chain is, in fact, a competitive weapon. Being able to get the best products globally is, in fact, a competitive weapon. And so people started investing in supply chains, which then led to the investment in technology and all the technological advancements that have come with inventory management and transportation management and scenario. You've mentioned scenario planning. Just that's kind of probably the newest thing we can talk about at some point is the newest kind of you know forward-looking companies are starting to say, it's not about a discrete number, but it is about a bunch of what ifs, and are we
Right.
prepared for the different
Right.
what ifs? So,
It's interesting you talk about 2000 because if we cast our mind back to that, we'd seen massive growth in e-commerce really start to happen towards the late 1990s, and e-commerce was predominantly direct, right? So I'm sure to some extent that played a role in reshaping how people thought about supply chain, because if you're shipping direct to consumer, then your supply chain effectivity is right there in plain sight. You don't have these inventory buffers to sort of
that's
shield
right.
you.
That's right. 100%. You are exposed to the end consumer, and when that happens, you got to be doing things right. And again, the technology became available, and it was capable of doing things that prior to that it just wasn't capable of doing.
To what degree is also the impact of financial, really getting their heads around the balance sheet a lot more, right? So inventory is a balance sheet asset, and I think people who just live in the world of P&Ls don't always understand the impact this has on companies. But cash flow and capital is heavily dominated by in a manufacturer by inventory, right? And so you've got one prevailing force, which is the desire to maintain efficient balance sheets, keep inventory levels low, offset against this sudden pressure to delight customers. Is that a fair characterization of the trade-off?
It is, and I'd say this, Richard, that one of the biggest advances has come in. Nobody's against inventory per se; they're against unproductive inventory. And and I don't want to overstate the role of technology, but it is huge in supply chain. Before these more sophisticated inventory management tools, you didn't have the capability of slicing your inventory that way, and you didn't. So you kind of either put a bulk of inventory in and then just hope that it sold, or you just started trimming inventory, and quite frankly you might have lost a lot of sales because you trimmed the wrong things. And so as we got into 2000 and beyond, and the different ERPs started coming into place, and then the very specific inventory demand planning and production planning type software came in, we were able to really target exactly what inventory added value to the consumer and customer versus what inventory was just going to be dead stock sitting on the shelf. That was a big move, because again, I always say to folks that I work with, I always say, look, if this inventory is moving and it's selling at the right price, I don't care if you put a lot of inventory on this. In fact, I want you to put a lot of inventory on the shelf, because that's how we make money.
Right. So there's a highly qualitative, sort of velocity orientated view of what
Velocity.
represents
I want
good
to say
inventory.
what. Yeah, let me just add one thing,
Yeah.
because I want to quote a person that was kind of a mentor of mine early on. Is he said about inventory? He said, just think of everything as a head of lettuce, and if you think of everything as a head of lettuce, you manage inventory very specifically, because you don't have the defense of, well, it's not going to be obsolete and it's not going to go bad. People will do that in the
Right.
kind of durable space. But
Well, I mean, Morris and I both spent time in the personal computer industry where inventory literally does perish because a chipset has a 6-month life on it before it's obsolete. And so
right,
if you're holding obsolete versions of inventory, then you're writing it off. I mean, or you're selling it off very cheaply. So that
it is a
perishable
head of
model.
lettuce.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it is a head of lettuce. I mean, it really, and that sort of encouraged that whole industry to become high velocity because you can't touch this stuff. It has to move through because the next wave of technology is right behind it.
right, right. Yeah. And I
And
think
then,
more and more, a lot of industries are getting that way because almost everything's technology in some manner. Worked at appliance company. I mean, the amount of technology in your appliances now are unbelievable. And if those sit around,
right.
you got a problem there too. So,
So that's a great point. The notion of what products are, the intrusion of software and sort of software eats the world into all of these products and chipsets taught us a couple of things, right? I would suggest. I'd love to get your reaction to this. So COVID hits, and we suddenly realized that we're dependent on semiconductors for everything, including
yeah,
refrigerators. And semiconductors are suddenly a supply chain problem. And I think that was a big shock for everybody in manufacturing who suddenly realized these critical components, the supply might not be as robust as they'd hoped. And so COVID changed a lot, right? It changed how we thought about risk.
absolutely. 100% it changed it. And what it did is it really, that's what really got us into this next horizon of planning around scenario planning. We had over the span of the last, I'll call it 30 years, we had built up a globalized supply chain that, interestingly enough, both geopolitically and efficiently from a supply chain standpoint, really made it almost immaterial where you got the product from. And we hadn't had any major disruptions, even when we had skirmishes in the world. Things still flowed pretty well. Um, but then, but then COVID hit and the world trade stopped. And when that stopped, all of a sudden you realize, wow, this is coming from all over the different places in the world, which then caused people to say, all right, what are the scenarios that could happen, and how do we protect ourselves against those scenarios?
So there's a lot of talk now about risk mitigation, but doesn't risk mitigation come with a price tag? I mean, the traditional form of risk mitigation was inventory. That and if we don't want to go back to an era of exposure to high inventory levels up and down the supply chain, we need to get a lot more sophisticated about balancing risk with customer demand and balance sheet. Do we now have three dimensions as opposed to two?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I want to add one other word to that, and that's agility. So you have the risk mitigation for sure, and that's essentially an insurance policy. You got to decide how much of an insurance policy you want to buy. But also agility, I think, is key because no one's going to allow you as a company to incur and pass on incredibly higher costs just in case there's another COVID. But what they're going to do is they're going to expect you to be able to move and be able to shift. And I always talk about the fact that you want to have early warning signals that tell you that something is coming, that will be a major issue. You then have scenario plans and mitigation plans that you've already thought deeply through that you can begin to
Mm.
execute. So and I talk about that. What I talk about there is then you're going to take the body blow because you're not going to stop it, right? I mean, take what's going on in the Red Sea. Any company isn't going to stop that, and so that's happening. So you take the body blow, but because you have the agility and you've done the pre-planning, you then can come out of it much faster than your competitors in a better position. And so that is that is big versus just saying, I'm just going to plow a bunch of inventory in because that's like buying
Mm.
insurance, but you can't afford it.
Yeah, and that's part of the sort of concept of, as we discussed, scenario planning, right? Being able to really, find solutions that are set up to handle unexpected events. But the one thing that is expected is that there's going to be an unexpected event, right?
It's going to be an unexpected event.
Yeah.
It's always going to happen. And,
So
but the key
system.
is, I mean, embedded in my answer there, Richard, was the key is what are your early warning indicators? I call them red flags. What red flags are you watching? And you're watching them go up and down this flagpole. And then all of a sudden it starts going up and it starts going up. And at what point does it get where you say, okay, I got to start doing something about this because this is starting to look real, you know?
So, as you can imagine, a lot of the audience that are listening to this come from the customer experience sort of perspective on all of this. And manufacturers in general have been a little slower to get in front of this. And I wonder if that stems from historical view that said, the channel handles the customer. We're here, we build things and we run our factories efficiently, which, 10, 15 years ago, build to stock, plan inventory, put inventory into the field, and then we're done and dusted. And the channel's going to help manage the customer. Is that, well, first of all, would you agree with that statement? And secondly, is the channel overrated as a buffer from the customer, in your opinion?
First, I agree with the first part of it. I do believe that that's the case, and probably as you know, when individual stores exist, were the dominant channel and those things, and that's probably true with the advent of bigger stores and chain stores around the country and those things. It does become more of the product is on a warehouse shelf, and the consumer's coming in and getting it. If it's not there, if there's something wrong with it, the consumer's looking at the name on the box and saying, "Hey, what's going on with this?" I do believe that buffer existed, but I also do believe that has changed, and more the consumer looks at where that product's coming from. In fact, even you see on some boxes now of different products, especially food products, everything, you can scan the QR code. And heck, you can even see beyond the manufacturer. You can see back into the channel that supported the manufacturer and see where products are coming from. And that then exposes you to the consumer. And therefore, a manufacturer has to really think about how they're looked at by that consumer.
Yeah, and your name's on, as you said, is on the box. I mean, when COVID disrupted supply chains, the channel, quickly realized that they were stuck between the consumer and the manufacturer, and they weren't always in a rush to defend the manufacturer, right? They, at some extent, they were pretty inclined to say, "Hey, listen, this isn't our problem." And so the consumer becomes very conscious of the fact that at the end of the day, it's the manufacturer that's making this work.
Yeah, and I think there's a big, and this is again more of a, I'll call a outgrowth of globalization and cities around the world and those things is, you know, more and more everything's a pull through versus a push. Everything's a pull through, and so you have to really build the desire for the consumer to pull your product through the channel versus maybe 30, 40 years ago, you could, or 30 years ago, you could more push product. You could push product, and there was only one type of this, and there was only one type of that, and so if it was there, the consumer bought it, and that's not the case anymore. So,
Well, and there's no more margin out there to be able to do that, right? I mean
right.
to some extent, if you had large margin on material margins on product, you could afford to have stuff sitting out there because you'll make it up when you sell it. But margins have collapsed pretty much on every product.
Yeah. I mean that's where the velocity comes through because the faster you can move it.
So when you look forward now and you think about where we're going to be over the next 5 to 10 years, you sort of hinted to this with all this scenario planning conversation. But what do you think are the big changes that we're going to have to embrace if we're going to get better at this?
Well, I mean, I'll talk about scenario planning in just a minute, but I want to talk a little bit what the consumer's expectation is going to be. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we're going to have to change at the same pace the consumer demands are changing or faster. If you move any slower than the consumer demand, then you're going to have a problem. So let's say that I think there's been a lot of talk on this. A lot of people have done a lot more research than I have on it. But I do believe that personalization is going to be the big item that we're going to have to structure. We being all manufacturers, all supply chain, we're going to have to structure our capabilities around the ability for me to personalize an experience for Richard, personalize an experience for Kevin. And it's going to be much more than the product. So the product, if you have some unique product that has a patent on it and it's the only product made in the world, that's one thing. But most products aren't that way. There's other things. So it's all the items around that product that personalize the experience for the individual. I actually heard two quotes that I really have kind of lived by. One was by a gentleman that wrote a book called Unreasonable Hospitality. It's about a gentleman that built out what eventually got rated as the best restaurant in the world, and in New York City. And his comment was their whole model was one size fits one, meaning they're going to always personalize it to the individual. And then actually a customer of ours that spoke at one of our events, she said personalization is the new luxury, which I absolutely love that line.
Great
And
phrase, yeah.
And so I believe that. So that has a lot of implications that we could talk for hours on for a manufacturer and how we do things, those things. I think from just a pure supply chain and logistics standpoint, I do believe that this getting away from a discrete number, a discrete plan that you put in place and you put, footers 10 foot down in the ground and, that's it. And you're not going to move for 50 years. Those days are gone. You have to be agile, and the agility comes with that scenario planning where you're going to have to be able to move. I mean, today, if you look at the flows of foreign direct investment, a lot of it's going into Mexico from a supply chain standpoint. A lot of it's going into Vietnam from a supply chain standpoint. But who's to say that that's going to be the answer 5 years from now? Something could happen. We all know something could happen in both of those areas. You got to be able to move again if need be.
I think it's interesting you're commenting about personalization. If you have a more complex product, which we just described, where you've got every product is to some extent going to be surrounded by software, you could argue, right? I mean, every product's going that way and is hyper personalized. That's a manufacturing nightmare, right? Because manufacturing efficiency has come from ignoring those realities and basically being able to, Henry Ford, any color as long as it's black. Right? And going to the complete opposite is going to be an enormous strain on systems and thinking. And I think your point about starting to anticipate things, getting in front of things, is the only way you're going to even narrow down the range of possibilities to something you can plan to.
Yeah, I mean, let's take a little ride on a history lesson here. If personalization was the model long before Henry Ford, that was the model. I mean, if you needed I don't know, make up a tool, you needed a saber to go fight a war somewhere or go kill an animal so you can eat tonight. You went to a blacksmith who banged out a saber for you, like made you what you needed, and he banged that out. And then from an efficiency standpoint, we went to these massive scale, manufacturing plants with huge assembly lines, and we did away with the customization. We did away with that person banging that out just for you. And we went to, hey, if I can pump all this out, get incredibly efficient, lower the cost so that everybody can afford one of these things, then everybody's going to love that. And that worked. And now we're starting to say with the technology available and with all the things going on available, I ought to be able to have those efficiencies and customize it for you. And that's what I believe is happening
Mhm.
in the world today.
And that's gonna demand a lot of technology, which is probably a good lead in for talk a little bit about your new role at Shaw. So you've moved into this business transformation role for a very large company with a lot of moving parts. Um, so obvious question is, what is business transformation at a company like Shaw Industries?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing this role develop across multiple companies, multiple industries, and it's just the ability to take a step back from the day to day. Obviously, when I was running supply chain, I mean, I was, in the day to day, people calling every 5 minutes asking about something that was going on, and take a step back, look at the picture overall, and just try and see, is that picture leading us to where we want to go with our company strategy 5 years from now. Some say 5 or 10. 10's pretty far out there, but 5 years for sure. You know, I get the opportunity to be able to take the time and really think about and see where we want to head as a company, where, using the strategies and the vision that our CEO and anybody in my role would see from their CEO. And then just make sure that we're heading in that right direction, or do we need to make a shift? But I do think that in any company, and that's why I think there's been a little proliferation of this title, transformation officer, transformation vice president, whatever. There's been a proliferation of it because I think everybody's realized that you do need one, two, three, depending on the size of the company, you may need more than that. People that aren't just so swamped in the day to day that they can't see the trees. They can't spend, they don't have enough time. It's not that they can't do it intellectually or anything. They just don't have enough time. And I'm blessed in this role by being able to have that time and being able to spend time on that, and then advise and consult within the company on what on where I think we need to go. And we have a very small team. It's purely collaborative. I mean, I have to influence and collaborate and help folks, but that's what their role is. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, no kidding. And you see the term digital transformation brought a lot. There's got to be, I think almost it's the same thing at some level. And when people say digital transformation, they're looking at it perhaps through a technology lens, but the goal is always the same, right? Technology is there to serve a purpose, and business transformation that purpose. So wouldn't you argue digital transformation, business transformation? We're talking about the same thing. We're just talking about tools we're using.
Yes, there's one caveat I'd make is the the danger of some digital transformations is that we do what people have called this. They call it, you pave over a cow path, where you take a process that isn't really effective, isn't efficient, or quite frankly maybe even shouldn't be being done. It's a process that got put in place 10 years ago for a
Right.
great reason and then just never died, right? And the reason went away, but it's still there. And then you digitize it. And now all of a sudden you have a process that shouldn't be being done, but it's being done at a massive scale and at a massive velocity because it's been digitized. You've almost caused even more of a problem. So we like to talk about business process first, then digitize the things that need to be digitized, and quite frankly, stop doing the things that shouldn't be done anyways.
It's a good reminder. I think Concrete in the Cow Paths was Mike Hammer, which has to be early '90s.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, and I think it was he was writing about business process reengineering, which was the term of art at the time. But point
Yeah.
point is that concept is pretty valid today. And I think it's also true when you think about applications of technologies like AI, where there's a tendency for companies to think we've got to use AI as opposed to thinking, what's our business problem, and is AI the relevant technology? How could it be applied to solve it? I think if you put the technology first, as you say, the risk is you either concrete the cow path or you end up just buying technology at the end of the day without direction.
Yeah, 100%. I think it would be a neat survey to do to find out how much technology is. it's being utilized at 50% or less of its
Right.
stated capacity. My guess is it's a lot,
Well,
in the
yeah.
business.
Well, and yeah, in the old days when you used to sell on-premise software, you used to call it shelfware, right? When
Yeah,
it
much,
didn't get used at all, just sat on the shelf. Um,
yeah, yeah.
so as a perhaps a closing question here, when you think about the customer now, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier, they're becoming more demanding. What else do you see out there from a customer perspective? Did COVID reshape the way customers thought about the relationship with vendors, or is this just a long arc that we're seeing as customers redefine what they want out of their vendors?
Well, I mean, I think what COVID did, and I think a lot of people, a lot brighter than I am, have said this, is that it really just sped up the development cycle massively. I mean, something that might have taken 15 years to do took 3 years to get to. And I think that same is true for the customer and consumer expectations. I mean, everyone will say this, and I give them credit. Amazon had changed the world in terms of people's expectations because there was a someone had said this once. It might be a Jerry Seinfeld joke where he said, "I wish we had never landed on the moon because then people wouldn't be able to say, well, if we can send a man to the moon, why can't we do this?"
Yeah,
And I say the same thing about Amazon because even though things are completely different, big bulky items, all that stuff, and they don't want to hear that what they're saying. Like, hey, if I can order something at 5 o'clock tonight and get it tomorrow morning at my house, why can't you just track your trucks? Why can't you just? So it's like you're always being compared, which is good. That's great because it's caused us to do things that us being manufacturers and distributors and Shaw, it's causing us to do things and set standards for ourselves that we may not have set before. So the consumer, I think, has sped up those demands, but that's just nature, though, that was going to happen. I mean, if you believe that the human condition is always improving, then you have to believe that this is where we were headed. It's just, I mean, we're getting wealthier, we're getting better standard of living, we're getting all these different things, and this is just part of it. It's just probably what would have taken 15 years to do now probably took 3, 4 years to do.
that's a really positive point on which to end, and an optimistic idea, and the pace being set by the leaders, and we're now holding a catch-up game to some degree with the best companies in the world, which not a bad idea when you think about it. Kevin,
That's right.
absolutely terrific talking to you. We could talk a lot longer on this, but we really appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us and talking about supply chain manufacturing and customers.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It was fun.
Thanks for listening to the CX Iconoclast from OCX Cognition. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you won't miss any of our thought-provoking conversations. And please get in touch if you want to learn more about what OCX Cognition's predictive CX analytics platform can do for your business by providing complete insights into every account, continuously updated and connected to operations. You'll find contact info in the show notes.